Hi, I'm Ketki.
And I'm Sanaya, and we're Thinking People. Today, we're thinking about love at the movies with Professor Shakuntala Banaji. In this episode, we're exploring the evolution of rom-coms and the forms of escapism they have traditionally offered. We talk about why we love stories and how these films inform expectations and hopes regarding our relationships.
Life moves fast. Tune in to think about it.
Hi Shaku, hi Ketki. Thank you both for joining us today for this episode. And for our listeners, our guest today is Professor Shakuntala Banaji, who is Professor of Media Culture, Social Change, and Program Director for the MSc in Media Communication and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So super glad to have both of you here. Shaku.
Great to see both of you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's on a topic that's really close to my heart.
So, today we will be talking about changing notions of love, its disappointments, and how romantic comedies or movies in general have offered an outlet or escape from an often disappointing reality for so long. We'll also be looking at the rom com genre more broadly and assessing where it stands in 2024. Has it hit a wall, and is it unable to keep up with viewers' expectations and experiences? Finally, we'll also be talking about how we talk and think about love in 2024. What is our experience of love when its arena is often an algorithm or a phone screen? And how are these changing ideas of love responding to and informing rom coms and our love stories? So, I think to start off, we thought it would be a good idea to kind of get things going with a quick icebreaker question. So, what are both of your go to feel good rom coms? And Shaku, I think if you could answer this as an avid movie watcher and not a film scholar.
Sure. That's a wonderful question. And obviously, I've been on this earth a number of years longer than both of you. And the romance genre as a whole is really one of my favorite joys and pleasures watching films. And I watch films in multiple different languages. If I had to say in the last 5 years, what's a romance film that I've really liked, it's the Ranjith film Nachatiram, Nagaragiradu, which I found absolutely amazing. I don't know if either of you have seen it. It was full of all kinds of modern and contemporary different types of romance relationships. Going back a few years, I guess I would say that tragedies, so Brokeback Mountain might be another one of the films that I have at the top of my list. It's obviously so sad. And then more recently, there have been many much more small town romances coming out of India, which I really, really like. So some of the films which don't get exposure in the diaspora, but which really did quite well in India, I think I would go back and watch those multiple times. Bareily ki Barfi, films which touch on much more accessible stories of life. But I guess you could say that more recently, I went to the cinema and I watched, just as an avid viewer, as you said, Rani ki Prem Kahaani. And there were aspects of that I was like, oh, I absolutely love this. This is wonderful. And then there were bits of it that I felt, oh my goodness, why are you doing this? Why is everybody so wealthy, for example? Why is everybody so polished? And so I always go to the heart of the relationship in the story, and it's the things around the relationship that distract me from the romance.
Is there a movie from, I guess, when, I don't know, when you were growing up, when you were a teenager maybe, or, early young adulthood?
Dozens of such movies, but the John Sayles film Lone Star, which is actually a mystery movie, but contains a very, very beautiful and complicated romance between a sort of old, hard-bitten detective and a woman that he meets along the way, is just one of the most beautiful romances that I've ever seen, and it contains some of the most beautiful music. And I think actually music for me makes romances. So that's a long way back. Then, of course, when I was doing my doctoral research, there was a huge spate of romances coming out. Dilwale, Dulhaniya, went to see that first day, first show, went to see Kuch Hota Hai, first day, first show. I was in the middle of, really sort of unpacking what does the romance genre mean to the audience. And it was just, I was blown away as an audience member, also very angry about certain things. So, of course, part of enjoyment is also being able to engage angrily with bits of romances that you don't like and that you find very frustrating. Over the years, there have been just so many of these films that, had there been playback in the same digital way that there is now, I would probably have gone and played back scenes. But because there wasn't, I had to go and watch the whole movie 30 or 40 times. So that, and going even further back, way back into the early 70s when I was growing up and was a little kid, there were so many really amazing romances back then. Many of them, of course, ending very tragically. So films like Silsila and all of the Amitabh Bachchan films, which had other storylines going on in the background.
Yeah. Silsila has a lovely soundtrack as well.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
yeah. No, thanks for sharing. When Sanaya and I were thinking about this episode, we kind of like thought of rom-coms as like a subgenre within the larger like love story. So when both of us were sort of reflecting on like what our go-to feel-good like rom-com is, we thought of, okay, we'll think about our favorite like rom-com and then our favorite love story. For me, because the formula of the rom-coms are a little bit more formulaic, there is like a happy ending and there is this like comedic element to it, whereas like love stories can encapsulate so much more, right? So when I was thinking about like my go-to feel good rom-com, the first thing that came to mind was the Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks 1998 film You've Got Mail, which is written by Nora Ephron. And every time I think about this movie, I smile. I think it's like Nora Ephron's finest work. I mean, like I like it a lot more than When Harry Met Sally, which is like considered like the seminal, like rom-com and sort of like redefined the genre. And I really think it's because it's like a film sort of encapsulates like what is it that makes rom-coms great. And there is this like plot which is essentially, Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks are these like business rivals, but both of them have this like online romance with each other under hidden identity, so they don't really know who the other person is, and we're privy to like their online conversations and the two of them like reflecting on their days and their lived experiences and things like that. So this central tension in the film is of course like very compelling. The thing that I really love about the film and why I return to it often is like it's this like atmosphere that it creates, the mood it evokes. It like kind of slowly draws you in. It has this like beautiful soundtrack of like jazz and blues, Motown and things like that. And then they do like this world building through like funny, eccentric secondary characters. It's set in New York in the fall. So the city is as much a character in the film because you see these like characters interacting with the city and then talking about it. So it's interesting you said that like, the external elements kind of like distract you from like the central romance. But for me, and especially in this film, I think they add to it. And I also feel like for especially like rom-coms to be successful in that sense, I feel like two love interests have to have like obviously the chemistry and life outside of it, which then interacts with the central story. So as I was thinking about it, I was just like, I think this is why I really love this movie, because every time I put it on, I just escape into this world. And I think like these are the sort of elements that come together to make it like really fascinating. I mean, I just love watching it. So
That's really interesting that you should say that the sort of city also becomes a trope in our viewing of rom-coms. And I think that's very true. I think often romance is sort of combined with a romance for place. It's a particular place. And when you have a romance that doesn't have a place, so for example, ones that really sort of just focus in a room, or like a lot of the more modern Netflix series don't really build place that much. They sort of take place in back rooms and bars and houses or college dorms. And I think that has a very different resonance. And one of the films I was thinking of that actually where I can't remember the place very much, but where I remember the film and it just sort of lights me up is Eternal Sunshine of the Perfect Mind. Just one of those sort of, and it's not exactly so I guess I'm going more for the romance than the comedy aspect
yeah,
of these
yeah.
films. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And then when I was reflecting on like what my favorite love story is. It's like it's a trilogy, and I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the Before trilogy by Richard Linklater. When I first watched Before Sunrise, which is the first film, it kind of really blew my mind that somebody could explore romance in this way, which he's essentially exploring connection through conversation. There is no overarching plot. Time is sort of like the central device that is used to kind of explore the love story between these two characters, Jesse and Celine, you know. And through the course of the trilogy, we sort of see them kind of live a life, and also their relationship develop. So like the first film, you know, there's this element of like excitement to it. It like charges you because it ends on this like cliffhanger moment, and there's like this sort of will they won't they meet again. And you know, there is that you feel compelled by the possibility of like love and connection. And then the second film, they're like, I think it's 12 years later, so they're in their mid 30s, and you realize, oh, they haven't met in all these years. And but then eventually, you know, they spend another evening together in Paris, and you know, it is alluded that they get together at the end of the film, so you feel reassured and satisfied. And then the third film, which is Before Midnight, they're in their well into their 40s. You know, they are a couple now, and this film is a slightly more like jaded one. So when I watched it for the first time, it came out in 2013, I actually felt kind of disappointed because it takes their relationship into a different direction where, you know, they start exploring like the complexities of what comes with like a long-term relationship. You know, there's it's complicated, it's messy. You know, they spend most of the film fighting and arguing. There is a resolution at the end, but you know, you sort of like you come out of it feeling a little disappointed, but also, you know, accepting the fact that okay, this is what it means to really live a life with someone. That it starts off romantic, you know, exciting manner, and then it eventually it's just two people living together, and what does it really mean. And I think it explores like what love how love changes and evolves through time. And he quite literally uses time in this trilogy to do that, which I just love and find really really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I would go even further and say about those films that the last one out of them is trying to keep pace with the age of the audience as well. So they're trying to stay relevant, because you can make endless number of sort of teenage rom-coms, and there have been so many over the years. The one that springs to mind, I think, that 10 Things I Hate About You was one that was really popular when I was a high school teacher, and I was teaching students between those ages, and they really, because I was an English teacher and we were teaching English, Shakespeare, doing drama, that whole film resonated so much with the students that I was teaching, and I just remember everyone wanting to go and watch that, and that was really the thing at the time. I think there are also, not just in terms of favorite rom-com, favorite romance, but there's also obviously the tragic romance genre, which comes from Romeo and Juliet. And having been a teacher, I think you'd have to talk a bit about that and how much people return to those tragic love stories. And because you mentioned escapism of some kind, and I wonder whether there is not also a form of escapism which leads us into wanting to see other people's tragic love stories. Because one of the very first huge sort of love stories that relaunched film in India in the cinema, I think, in the late 1980s was Qayamat Se Qayamat Tak. Although, of course, these two leads, Juhi Chawla and Amir Khan, were so beautiful, and there was something very sort of glowing about them. It was an absolutely horrible film in many other ways. These, you know, you're basically watching two young people falling in love and being destroyed in the Romeo and Juliet mold by all kinds of bad decisions and social conventions and very violent, aggressive masculinity in there. And yet I kept going back to that film, and so did many of the people I was interviewing for my PhD. People kept going back and forth. And then another film which has a very sort of tragic undertow is Bombay, which was initially Mani Ratnam brought out in a different language. And then you've got the sort of these tragedies and grief knitted through the story. And I would argue that actually those films have remained more popular than the films which were very sort of simple love stories where people sort of had fun, laughed, charmed each other, got together, and then it ended. So there've been dozens of those American, very lightweight, bubbly, champagne type young people comedies, rom-coms, and they just haven't made that kind of an impact, either in terms of Bollywood loving to steal the storyline and repeat it again and again. The sort of the Romeo and Juliet trope or the Leila Majnun trope has absolutely gathered people over the years. So why would you, if you're in a really sort of quite unhappy situation, unhappy relationship, as many people, not just young people, but middle-aged women and middle-aged men that I have talked to, many people feel so frustrated with their everyday relationships, and they're not quite sure why they feel it. Some people would say, oh, they just can't accept reality. But the argument would be, then if you want to escape, you'd go to one of the sort of more beautiful types of reality. But really, no, many of those people are either trying to find an imaginative way of solving their own problems. So they're going back again and again to the romance genre, not just to the rom-com genre, not just to the romantic tragedy genre, but they're going back through romances in other types of films to try and find something that answers their own question. So it's not escapism at all. If anything, I would say, and I find this so fascinating, many of us go to the romance genre as a form of therapy.
Just like a couple of weeks ago, I sent like my group chat with a couple other friends. I said, I feel like crying. What should I watch? Is something that comes up very often for me because I'm like, I am feeling very emotional right now and I don't want to dismiss those emotions. Neither do I want to confront them with like in any real sense, but I would like to experience them nonetheless. So let me somewhat vicariously live it out through somebody else's story. So that 100% has happened.
Absolutely. And I would just add that there's an element of, can I identify with the characters? Just going back to what you said about the third of the three Linkletter films, I think one of the things about identification with particular characters is really important in terms of age. And we have also seen in terms of, whether the movie addresses some full spectrum of sexuality and gender, or whether the movie is very, very strongly correlated with heterosexual expectations of romance. And therefore, as we move into talking about audiences, I think it's worthwhile saying romance movies the world over are not really always aimed at a universal sort of audience. They often have in mind a particular audience, whether that audience happens to be what you and I call mainstream, which you would expect, or whether that audience is seen as niche. And increasingly, and this is a tendency, I think, in not just in sort of Western countries, but also in Asia, not only in India, but in Asia, there is more and more expectation and experimentation with stories which give women more power than they traditionally had in the typical heterosexual romance. So you wanted to know a little bit about changing trends, and this is one of them. So stories where a man is wooing a woman, but also where a woman might be wooing a man, or a story where young people are experimenting and thinking about their sexuality in different ways. And I've watched films now from countries where the public might be said to be quite disapproving of alternative sexualities, and maybe even quite homophobic. The norms there are actually changing. So I've watched two very, very beautiful and moving romantic films, not comedies, but also not tragedies, coming out of Brazil, several coming out of places like the Philippines and Thailand, several from China. And obviously that's a specific, it's seen as a niche genre, but it's getting increasing numbers of viewers. And I'll tell you why, because across China and Japan, there is now a huge, not subgenre, but just a huge genre of something called boy love films. I don't know if you've heard of this, but Korea, Japan, China are now absolutely producing probably like a bulk of content in this sphere. And these are kind of, you'd call them queer romances, really, where there are young men leads, one who's traditionally masculine and the other one who seems to embody some traditional feminine aspects. So young men and men in general are getting a lot more exposure in queer romances the world over because these have been so popular. They're making so much money for Tencent and other Bilibili and other streaming platforms.
And now that we're talking about audiences, so I know, Shaku, you have actually done extensive work with audiences, and we both of us like consulted your book Reading Bollywood for a previous episode of ours as well, and especially for this one. And I know you spoke to a number of young people in Bombay and in London for that, and their reactions, responses to some of these films, their attitudes, their orientation towards love stories in general, and what should be depicted on screen. So now that we're seeing like different types of stories on screen, and as you said, like it may not always be that a movie has a very wide audience in mind. So how has this audience kind of evolved from 2006 to right now, with all these changing sensibilities in response to changing content? Like, for example, more a plethora of queer love stories. Does that mean that, is there a backlash to that in certain corners? Are there people who are more willing to open themselves up to these kinds of stories? What's the audience mix for a love story or a romantic comedy now?
If we're talking strictly about Bollywood, then you'd have to say that there are three distinct audiences that films tend to orient themselves towards. And those don't really break down by gender and sexuality, they break down by region. So, in a way, there are regional audiences, or small regional and small town audiences. Then there's the general urban public in big cities and metros. And then there's the diaspora. So romances, so big budget romances like Rocky or Rani, are clearly aiming to capture a bit of the regional audience, but they're not saying their major income is coming from there. They're seeing their major income is coming from metros and the diaspora. And that's been a tendency. I mean, it doesn't really account for why they set so little stock by small town, rural, or other regional audiences. But perhaps they're expecting that regional and vernacular cinemas will capture those audiences, or perhaps they're expecting that the kinds of themes that they want to explore, which is, women's voice, speaking back, equality in marriage and relationships, that those are never going to appeal to those, which I think is I think that's absolutely wrong in some ways. I think there should be many more romances made set in much more humble settings, perhaps similar to the setting of a film like Swadesh. And I think we can't just wait for foreign funded films or films funded in multiple different ways by Channel 4 and Canal Plus and all of these different foreign fund to make a Netflix film in which you've got a villager. So then what's happening is you're sort of fetishizing the idea of the village, and you're doing it to display the village in a particular way to an audience in the diaspora, an audience across the world. So in this context, there is a film that I wanted to mention that I thought was actually very beautiful, but and really, really looked at class relationships, but failed in the end really to capture that the audience of the kinds of people who might benefit from imagining love and life in a different way. And this is the film Sir. I don't know if you have watched that. I mean, in some ways, it follows a very sort of cheesy pathway. A maid who works in quite wealthy, elite, urban, intellectual guy's house, and he's got very sort of upper class friends. He works in a profession where he would very rarely come into contact with this woman. She's an aspiring seamstress. She's very brilliant. She designs her own clothes, but she's sort of in a difficult, complex family situation. So gradually they become closer to each other, and at the end of the film, there's a sort of moment when you think they've probably gotten together. They don't show that. So it's very different from Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge or Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum. There's no fanfare. It's quite low key. In a way, it's a bit like the film Lunchbox. I don't know if any of you have seen that. Just ordinary, wonderful film, and ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. But also it does take off into the fantasy sphere. It tries at various points to show how class tensions and caste tensions perhaps influence how other people would imagine a relationship. And it starts to put its finger on some of the more difficult and tricky things about the changes in the scenarios that we see in modern films. So let me give you some examples. So for example, as India has got more and more restrictive in terms of its laws allowing cross-caste or cross-religious romance, which you'd have thought in a democracy, we would be sort of in 2024, that we would be much more open to allowing people to make their own choices. And India has instead got the state involved in a very big way, in a very authoritarian way, in a very patriarchal and macho way, which is really bad for men in domestic relationships and in the domestic sphere. So as it becomes increasingly unthinkable for people to choose their own partners, as it becomes more and more interesting to see how these films navigate that. And that splits the audience in bigger and bigger ways. Now, why does it split the audience? It splits the audience because you've got, let's say you've got a very, very popular film viewing segment of the audience, which I would say is sort of women between the ages of 25 and 45, who might be said to be the sort of choosers of the family film at various ages with children, whether that's on television. And you've got those women both wanting something new, but also unable to show that they want this new thing for fear of messing up domestic relationships at home. So you've got people now, because you can watch things on your phone, you can watch things on television in the daytime, because you can go to the whole, there's a whole series market, if you like, where romance is also taking off. You're never ever watching just a film in isolation. So you can watch things in relative anonymity, quite secretly. And so what you've got is these two parallel ways of viewing. You've got secret audiences, young women exploring films from other countries where they can actually get to see what sex looks like, or young men exploring homosexual and homosocial relationships in films while disavowing it in public, saying, no, I'm not interested, I'm not like this, I'm not queer, but actually in private going and watching these things, with the family going and watching a different kind of film. So it's not only that you have films made for different audiences, it's that you and I, or each of us, can also be attracted to films which are made for different audiences if we are able to watch them publicly or privately. So the audience is a really, really complex thing. But the audience that does not get served in general, I think, is the small town and village audience that actually does not think and imagine life in the restrictive, in the authoritarian, in very aggressively and toxically macho way that the government or that particular segments of the religious right want them to imagine relationships. And that group of people is not being served by Bollywood. They're certainly not served by foreign films, maybe by some, as I said, Tamil language, Marathi films, and so on and so forth.
I don't know if both of you have seen the very recent movie Lapata Ladies, which which I'm not sure if it's a romance in the traditional sense, but there are romantic elements, and this kind of it captures a lot of the themes that you were mentioning, Shaku. And I think that it was also I think there's a fantastical element to it as well, because I guess spoiler alert, in the end you see law enforcement, actually do their job the way they absolutely don't. And like I watched it after it had been a month after it had released. And in my mind, it was this small movie. Maybe it wasn't going to last more than a couple of weeks. But 6 weeks in, I watched it in a completely full cinema hall. And then it's come to Netflix just last week, I think. And now my Twitter feed is ablaze with people talking about the movie. But I found that to be interesting because it was kind of capturing like so many themes through the idea of like through something that a lot of women have to go through, like in a class agnostic way, but which is a marriage which you haven't chosen for yourself, and how you kind of approach that. And you have these two protagonists who are approaching it in very different ways, one who thinks it's a duty to fulfill, and then the other who wants to choose something else for herself. But yeah, I found that to be interesting because my big question was, who is the audience for this movie? Is it the people depicted whose lives are being depicted to us? Or is it like the people who like to intellectualize these things?
I don't think that those are the only two options. I don't think there's just sort of the intellectualizing middle class public of the cities and then the people that are being depicted. I think there's a spectrum of people in the city that will go and see Lapata Ladies, and some of them may be living out those kinds of stories. In fact, I have spoken to young women nowadays who are actually living out these kinds of stories. It's so, so surprising to me how many, in fact, perhaps how openly people are forced into relationships that they don't want to be in nowadays, including unbelievably young women who come from quite metropolitan areas, have got PhDs, like half a dozen or so of my master's students every single year, that's between 6 and 8 people, will be under tremendous pressure while they're doing their masters. It's literally like, when you finish your masters, you're going to go and get married. Forget all your romances. So what they might do, is try to convince their parents to have a little bit of, sort of openness to the type of person that they meet. But the fact that they're going to marry who their parents say they're going to marry is absolutely undisputable. Now, if you multiply that by people, in small towns, you multiply that by people in village areas, the choice, the levels of choice and the experience of romance just goes down, down and down. And yet, I will tell you from all of my interviews, every single one of these people is having romances. Whether those romances happen to be with a best friend at school or someone who picks you up from college, and those romances are giving them space. And what they're doing is they're trying to store up memories for the rest of their life. Now, will they go and watch La Pata Ladies? Probably a small segment of them will. Yeah, so it's not just for those who intellectualize. But is that film actually made for? Can it be made for? What would it look like for that film to be made for that audience? That's a really, really different question.
Yeah, if you just look at the numbers and the distribution, right? Like, firstly, this film was not a box office hit. Secondly, a lot of people will not be able to even access this film in theaters because it was simply just not playing in their local theaters. I think it was, for the most part, limited to urban centers and it had a very short run. And now it's being distributed on Netflix, which we know is, I think it's like a very small population in India that has a Netflix subscription. So if you think about it from like that perspective, clearly the industry behind this film does not think that this is for an audience outside of, say, urban centers. So that itself says a lot. And you also mentioned Swades. While that's not a love story, that also tanked on the box office and that had a big distributor. So I'm wondering also like how the economics of it informs how these films reach audiences. On the flip side, you have films like Dilwale, Dulhaniya, Le Jayenge, which are still running in theaters. So it's interesting. I think a lot in India, like the economics of film is really important in understanding audiences as well, because I think producers and directors think very strongly about, okay, I don't think that this film is going to work for the rural audience. The rural audience is, quote unquote, to use a crude word, like maybe not as intelligent in the same way, and they don't want complex stories. They want fantasy. They want simpler stories. They want the structure. So maybe that approach also, I think, informs a lot of the ways in which we experiment with telling stories about love and how we can do that as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. In fact, I did a piece of work around Lipstick Under My Burqa, and that was another film which I think it raised enormously important, really interesting themes, but the way in which it was received and the way in which it was conceived in terms of its marketing and circulation, it was never meant to reach the people that might actually be affected by or be able to change something. I mean, having a story about the sort of love and sexual needs of an older, unmarried woman, I mean, this is really important for many, many families and across society, but it would be seen as having some kind of negative effect. And here I want to talk a little bit about the effects discourse, because a phrase which we use, which is called economic censorship, and what that means is you use the idea of circulation and money to freeze out particular themes. Now, why might you do that? Obviously, there are things which the government doesn't want you to show. There are things which particular political parties, sort of vigilante groups in the far right, will immediately come and threaten you for doing. So, for instance, the Deepa Mehta film Fire, right, received death threats. They were going to burn down the theaters. Mobs did turn up outside theaters. And that is a film about a romance between two women in a sort of domestic setting, in a joint family setting, and it's sort of very mildly critical in some ways. It doesn't actually expose much of the violence that many people experience inside families, but it's a very beautiful romance. But it was sort of almost deliberately economically frozen out. And it was theaters shut down, people couldn't really show it. So many people don't take risks, or they embed their romances within another genre. Now, what does that mean? So a film that actually has a love story in the title, Gadar, a love story, embeds itself inside extremely nationalistic, extremely right-wing tropes, and extremely patriarchal, where the woman really does nothing to save herself. She's saved multiple times. The man is very sort of strong, macho, violent, able to sort of defend India and the idea of India as a nation which is non-Muslim, which sort of others particular groups. And we've had a series of films like that recently released, which are being funded massively, and they get money. And because we know that the funding system for films is so unfair and so inequitable in India, we know that economic censorship absolutely works. Particular types, even if I or you were to decide to make a film, if we decided we want to make a series or a series of films which addressed these complex questions, but in much more working class ways, in much more rural areas, we wouldn't be able to do it because we would not get the backers. We wouldn't get the funding. And that's because these people are not willing to take not just monetary risks, they're not willing to take political risks with romance.
This is interesting because if you think about this part of his career, but Shah Rukh Khan, who is probably the poster boy for romance movies in Bollywood, has taken a turn for action films, which have this broader narrative around patriotism, playing out this masculine ideal of this action hero. And then you kind of like slip in the romantic bits kind of half-heartedly, but you just have it there because you need Shah Rukh to do the hands, to do the eyes, to look, to be himself on screen. But even for him, like that's not where the money is. The money is in the big budget action movie with, an enemy that must be vanquished and the hero that is representing whatever you want to project onto him. Yeah.
And that is now, right? Like, because there was a time where the romantic film or the love story in India was the commercially successful product, if I can call it that. And now we're seeing that there is a trend of like action films, and which is why like these actors like Shah Rukh Khan, who are known for being like, in fact, like I watched The Romantics, which is this Netflix series on YRF, and in that Aditya Chopra talks about how Shah Rukh Khan started his career as an action hero, and he in fact told him that like, no, you have the eyes for a romantic lead, and he was right, and that is what makes Shah Rukh Khan Shah Rukh Khan. That's why we all like love him. And it's interesting now, if we think about it, that there is almost a kind of death of the love story in cinema. And that's sad to me. I want to bring up actually that anecdote, Sanaya. Like, we recently, Jab We Met was playing in theaters again. So Sanaya and I and a friend, we went to watch it. And on our way back, we were kind of reminiscing about like this era of like romantic comedies and love stories in Indian cinema. And we were like, what was the last great love story that Bollywood made? And our Uber driver turns around and he's like, Kabir Singh love story tha na. And all three of us were like, our friend was just like, Kabir Singh, love story hai. And he's like, yeah. And then our friend, he sort of just said like, औरतों को मारना पीटना ये ठीक है क्या? And then he just shut up. But basically, it's very interesting the direction in which, I think the love story has gone, especially in Bollywood. But yeah.
I think something that I have consistently thought about is how to view love stories when there is such a heavy power imbalance, and how to view it, and the fact that someone could view that as a love story, like how, like now there, so much of our public discourse is negotiating with power that is, inherent in gender relations, in different identity markers, thinking of it intersectionally. What does the notion of power mean for the love story?
Well, I suppose we can talk about three ways in which power circulates. I already talked a little bit about one of them, which is that many, many audiences, young people, women, in certain religions in India, don't have the kind of space in the public sphere that upper caste Hindu men do. They just don't have that space. And the women that get that space tend to be upper caste Hindu women who position themselves in alliance with those upper caste Hindu men. So if you speak out and you say, I think people should be allowed to choose their partners, for example, or if you speak out and you make a film or a series which becomes tremendously popular, you risk two things if you're somebody who doesn't come from a majority community. And I think I'm going to speak again to your point about why is Shah Rukh Khan making these nationalistic films or these very big blockbuster, agile me sort of action hero films. And he's doing that because even as a very, very successful film actor and producer, he has actually been, he and not just him, but his family, his children have been under threat in the current dispensation in India. And they're under threat because of their identity. So there is often something that's said by right-wing commentators, by authoritarian commentators in the US, now in the UK, in France, and even across South Asia, in Pakistan, in India. And they'll say this thing that is, identity politics is being played. And they'll say it as if it's being played by the people who are actually being excluded from the
Hmm.
public sphere. So if you or I, as a woman, say, that's really interesting that you have 7 people lined up for this job and all of them are men, they'll shout, identity politics, all of them are quality candidates, right? So they'll use the discourse of quality to argue that anyone who is talking about inequality is playing identity politics. Now let's go to the films. People will argue that, having a film which has, an equal love story between a woman and a man, and the woman is Muslim or the man is Muslim and the woman is Hindu, that's encouraging people to go and have those kinds of relationships. Now, in what world is it wrong actually to have those kinds of relationships? So the whole spectrum in terms of how films are screened and how they're censored is about power, because it's about power. If you want to have a relationship between two people from different faiths or faith communities in a film in India today, you have to ensure that it ends in tragedy. You have to ensure that they are punished for attempting to go against the ruling far right dispensation. You have to ensure that, as in the film Fana, one of them kills the other one in order to be loyal to the nation. Because actually, what has happened in a very insidious way is that power has inserted itself. Power was always in the domestic sphere, but nationalist power has inserted itself in the very choices that women often make about how they parent their children, for instance. So I have done recently a whole range of interviews in which it's become so clear that men are telling women, I don't want you to be tender or loving with son, because then he's going to turn out like they'll use some derogatory phrase. He's going to turn out. And basically the idea is that women can either make men who are macho for the nation, strong Hindu men who will go out and fight and will sort of not be drawn in or lured by other religions, or it will make these soft queer men. And sort of masculinity, Hindutva masculinity, very, very strongly is influencing power within the domestic sphere on and off screen. And so you're getting more and more films which are not really romances. They're what you might call the propaganda romance. And what they are propagandizing is all about power. They are propagandizing how it's good to be, and this is not just happening in India. It's not just happening because of the Indian government. It's happening in the US, it's happening in Israel, it's happening in many, many countries. It happens already on Egyptian television, on Saudi television. You have films which are basically telling people, this is the way to be a good, happy woman. You choose domesticity, what we might call the trad wife discourse in the West, which comes with this alt-right masculinity of incels and men who want to kill women. Now, I want to come back to your Taxi Driver and Kabir Singh, because a series of films recently, like Animal and Kabir Singh, these films are appealing to something that is a global phenomenon in terms of masculinity. And the fact that men might see it as romantic to absolutely punish and harm women or men who are not masculine in the same way that they are, or men who come from other communities, that is part of the rise of the far right trying to control our sexuality, our relationship to romance, our imagination of what the world is like. And yeah, they find that romantic. So I want you to understand that actually a lot of men find it romantic, the thought of slapping a woman in the face and then kissing her and saying, you're my baby, right? And that is so hard. But that was already foreshadowed in Bollywood of the 80s. There was a lot of that kind of aggressive, toxic masculinity, rape culture going on. And the rom-com today either has to deal with that or it becomes irrelevant or a tool of power.
How is the female viewer responding to this trend? Because especially in, I guess, heterosexual relationships, if the man or her partner will domestically and physically abuse her as part and parcel of a relationship, how are men and women relating with each other?
on screen or off screen. There are three ways in which viewers respond to those kinds of films. Women viewers, and young women viewers in particular, respond to those films. So there are three ways. One of them is in their spare time. As I said, viewers often have two different types of viewing. One they do in secret or quietly with people that really know them, and one that they do in public with their university friends, or they do with their families. So these two viewing channels. So increasingly, certain viewers will just quietly go and watch once a film that they really don't like. They'll watch it with the whole family, and then they'll be like, okay, that's fine. They'll pretend that they like it in the WhatsApp group afterwards, and then they won't watch it again because it's too traumatic, really. The second way of viewing is that you actually are very open about your critique of this, and young women from metros who can go to university and have a bit of space and are doing that are the ones who are most likely to take the brunt of criticism of that kind of aggressive masculinity, aggressive patriarchy in film. They're the ones, they're not just voting with their feet by not going to see these films, they're also basically trying to say to their partners or their boyfriends, I don't want to see this film. You take me to that kind of film, you're going for yourself. We'll either stay in and we'll watch something online, or we'll watch a series. And then there are the women from the majority community who have been already what you might call propagandized or hegemonized. They are very far down the rabbit hole of, this is going to mean that I have a better family life, right? And this is going to, if my daughter understands from now that she just needs to put up with it. And I have interviewed so many middle class women from the majority community in India who are utterly and totally embedded in this kind of violence. And they work in professions, they're professional women, and they will say things like, they're in their mid-40s to mid-50s, and they will say things like, oh my God, the young women today, can't you just put up with a couple of slaps? What's wrong with that? And he was just irritated. They'll make excuses repeatedly and constantly for domestic violence and grievous bodily harm done by men within the family to women. They themselves, very liberated and outspoken when they're in one circumstance, and absolutely quiescent, perhaps even humiliated, perhaps even in a situation they would always defer to the male elders in their families. And these were women who 22 or 25 years ago were saying the opposite. So there has been a kind of very clear effect of the propaganda which has come out in multiple television series, in multiple media, but I think most strongly, the 10 years of government propaganda about how to make it as a sort of a woman. And for them, the imagination that people from other communities are getting punished is enough to make up for every bit of humiliation they're experiencing in their everyday lives. So the only people who are actually hitting or beating or hurting them, the men in their own families who come from the same caste and class, but their imagining of the terrible, violent, aggressive rapist is always a man from another community.
I do want to call out though a very brave film, I think, which challenged this notion. It came out in 2020 called Thappad. I don't know if you've seen it, which I think is a really incredible film because it's about this newly married couple, and at some point in some party her husband slaps her, and it doesn't go any further than that. It's just that one slap, and that's enough to trigger her to file for a divorce. And I thought that was such a revolutionary film because I'm like, yeah, you don't have to depict something that is even worse than this because this is bad enough. So I definitely feel like there is the odd film that pops up here and there, but yeah, the picture you're painting is definitely very valid and not a nice one, to say the
I
least.
absolutely want to talk about that film because just in the middle of the pandemic, I was interviewing people and that film came up repeatedly. And especially amongst the women I just talked to you about, the sort of 35 to 55 or 45 to 55 age range, a lot of those women went to see that film but could not relate to it, even when they had been in situations of domestic violence or coercive control themselves. In fact, they were saying they found that her refusal of that scenario or her wanting to take it up, they were like, oh, this is so whiny. Why is this generation so whiny? Why are they making much ado about nothing? Right. And they would like, I don't want to go and see that film again. Or they would say something like, oh, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We need feel good films. And their idea of feel good is going back to one of those, K3G type films,
Mhm.
which also had some of that sort of patriarchal stuff built into them, but not as much.
Which is interesting, right? Like, because it's kind of the feel good or the where you want to escape into is something that's actually completely devoid of politics in a sense, or these dynamics. And that is, it's again, the word escapism comes up, right? Which is interesting, which is you're kind of like trying to escape your realities.
No, I wouldn't say that it's devoid of politics. I think it's just not aware, not
Right. Yeah.
self-aware,
Yeah.
and therefore provides like this like
Yeah.
comfortable cushion for people
Overt. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
land when they're watching something.
Yeah.
So that's well put. I totally agree. It's not devoid of politics when you want to escape. What you want to do when you escape is you escape into a world where there is a seamless agreement between the ideology of the film, or between the film's construction of a world and your belief about what the world should be. So the film's construction of a romantic world in which you can still be a very happy housewife bringing your husband's coat and cooking his food, but also where you're able to be charming as an entrepreneur. That kind of construction is what's known as the resolution of contradictions within the film. And so you escape from the fact that in real life those contradictions cannot be resolved except through the means of violence. In the real world, you have to have a degree of, usually a great degree of violence, whether that violence is through the law, where the husband says, if you divorce me, I'm taking the children and you'll be out on the street, or whether that violence is through slaps or burning brides, or whether that violence is through some of the really, really sad stories. Because I track romance in the news as well, and I track sort of things around, love jihad. I track things around the police going and rousting young couples from their hotel rooms, or whether that violence is the state interfering in people's relationships and families trying to kill their own children for having done something which they see as endangering the honor of the family. There is no resolution to these kinds of contradictions which doesn't involve some form of violence in the real world. But if you can go and watch a film in which the father is first, 3 hours of the film threatening to kill his daughter, and then in the last 20 minutes of the film says, I understand, you've done everything right, and lets her go on the train with her romantic lover, that's escapism, because that's seamless. But let's just imagine that Shah Rukh Khan in Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge had been playing not just a diasporic Indian from a fairly wealthy Hindu family, but he'd been playing a lower middle class Muslim cab driver. Just try to imagine what it would have meant for that father of the bride to let her go with this man. And it means something as an imaginary of the nation. What would it have meant if Shah Rukh Khan had been a woman? Right? And we know that all over the world, these actual love stories are taking place, they're being policed, and some of them are actually successful, but we are never allowed to see the successful resolution of an anti-patriarchal or a very egalitarian romance. And there was a film way back, I can't remember exactly which year it came out, called Mississippi Masala, which was absolutely, I think it was
Denzel Washington and
Denzel Washington, an absolutely amazing film. Very, very sad, very, very beautiful film about a Black and Asian romance couple in the US. And it was really, really sort of groundbreaking, just to show a cross-race romance.
I want to move away from, so like there is the political landscape and then there is the technology landscape, and if we can sort of like think about how we're even mediating notions of love and intimacy through technology, or how or the other way around, how technology is mediating our love lives, right? Because when I reflect on this, I really think that we're kind of in the midst of a very fraught relationship with intimacy. We on i- at any given point, if you go on social media, you're sort of like, you come across these buzzwords like situationship and love bombing and breadcrumbing, and then there's a whole lot of like therapy speak about, there's this red flag and that thing is toxic and you need to establish boundaries. So we've kind of, there's all of this, which is also it's interesting to also think about how we've kind of increasingly started to approach love in like this very clinical and like pragmatic way, and and that could very well have to do with like the social political context that surrounds it, and people just getting more and more empowered, and women, wanting to make the right decisions, and all of that is important and necessary. But at the same time, we're seeing this resurgence online, and this kind of like longing for the rom-com, or the love story. And so I wonder how you make sense of that. And yeah.
I'm very happy to have that question. I'm very interested in who the we is when you say we've seen a resurgence, because this is actually, I look at sort of romantic trends, and I also look at other trends in the lives of young people across the board. And much of that is not taking place on technology. So I think those of us who get
Yeah,
lost in
absolutely.
Instagram speak and Instagram story are
Yeah.
really a very, very small
Small.
minority when it comes to India.
Yeah.
Really tiny. We are all, I don't know where we're, 1/4%, if you like, of the country. So it's talking about resurgence. You can say there's been a resurgence of people wearing orange, or but there's hardly been a resurgence. And so the creeping in of a particular millennial vocabulary, which comes from therapy spaces, and sometimes I think is very important and very effective around, for instance, that's a red flag, but has also been caricatured by the right-wing media in the West and by very sort of sexist, misogynist cultures. There's been a resurgence of misogyny, if you like, which characterizes words like love bombing and gaslighting and red flags as this pathetic, anti-romantic, anti-woman and anti-man language. But when that is used seriously, then you get proper sensible critiques of films like Kabir Singh. Then you get critiques of films like Animal, and you get people actually trying to engage with and understand why you might have the Delhi gang rape and then multiple gang rapes happening unrecognized, unrecorded. You begin to understand the connection that is being deliberately, I think, created in the minds of many young men in rural areas, young men, working class men in urban areas, of the availability of women's bodies bypassing romance. Okay? And again, it's a generalization, but I think there is this feeling there amongst people that we don't need romance because we're going to get women's bodies one way or the other. And that is something that can happen. And now I'll tell you something. I did another interview podcast with a different group of people talking about mediation and technology and young women yesterday, and they were very, very sort of disturbed by what I was telling them, because I was telling them that a lot of between the ages of 15 and 19. A third of schoolgirls and young college-going women have experienced some form of online sexual harassment. They've had unwanted sexual images sent to them in a way where the young men are saying, this is my form of romance, this is how I'm doing romance. They've also had, and this is increasingly distressing and disturbing, they've been asked to give some form of their own bodies on screen, online, to display themselves in particular ways, which these young men are getting from the very, very ubiquitous and available porn everywhere. So pornography, the pornographic imagination of men of all generations and all ages and all regions across India. There is no single group that does not do this. The pornographic imagination of men is shaping the ways not only in which women use language online. So when you talk about red flags, oh my God, if we really understood what that means, I would be teaching young women, the minute he says to you, send me a photo of, I would be gone. I would be gone. Go, block, leave. But nobody's saying that. And these are it's almost like you're in a drought. You're in a drought of imagination. You're in a drought of love. You're in a drought of tenderness. And therefore you accept as these young women do get into terrible situations. So they will film themselves just doing an ordinary thing, like maybe cooking, but there's a couple of chest shots in that, or there's a couple of leg shots in that. That now there's a huge industry literally for selling personal videos of young women, personal private videos. So privacy is being constantly cut off for young women. And the minute a relationship ends, that's the first go-to for young men, many young men, not all. Some obviously will accept it, some obviously are heartbroken and might even sort of themselves suffer trauma from an end of a relationship. But many young women, and also many young queer men, are ending up suicidal, incredibly depressed, locked in their rooms because of these online circulation of their own private data, their bodies. And so romance can be very, very dangerous in many different ways to allow yourself to hope. Therefore, coming back to that therapy speak, the language that we're seeing on Instagram, I would say we need more of that. We need TikToks to come back and tell young women what to look for. We need much, much more, because we don't have really, really good sex and relationship education across India. And we need, at every stage, from primary school upwards, then if I told you the number of young people who talked to me about having been romanced by an older uncle, family friend, and then sexually abused when they were between the ages of 8 and 12, or between the ages of 6 and 12, you would be crying for days. You'd be crying for days. It is just heartbreaking. And then these same young people are going on to get very triggered, very upset, very angry, but to have no outlet, none whatsoever. Because therapy is not common in India. It's much easier to actually watch someone talking about it on Instagram than it is to go to it, because there's such a stigma against going to therapy.
Yeah. No, I think this has been I think this has been a great elucidation of why we even spend so much of our time thinking about these things, and why kind of ideas of love, intimacy, relationships preoccupy us so much, because love is not romantic in real life. It's harmful, it is dangerous, it doesn't make you feel like, on the best of days it may not make you feel very good. And that's where I think there's a hunger for maybe a slightly fantastical love story or a movie, which gives you this contained scenario with a beginning and an end, where something plays out in a mildly predictable manner that you can maybe relate to. But as we were speaking, I think we ended up talking quite a bit about the female viewer and just women in general. There's this one from the book Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, there's this one sentence which was stuck in my mind from the time I read it. I went over it again yesterday, and it just stuck out at me. Where I think towards the end, in the final chapter, like Shrayana is kind of talking about how more and more women in India are exploring work and sexual freedom in these like contained spaces, whether it is watching something on Netflix, whether it is even downloading a dating app of your own volition, and or doing something without your parents knowing it. But at the same time, the patriarchal notions of love are so intensely seeped through that there is this faith in the idea of a male breadwinner, and this idea of like marrying within your own community, and this juxtaposition of like ex- financial independence maybe on the one hand, exploration on the one hand, but this centuries old institution, she said, it's playing havoc with female self-esteem. And and I see this, at least just looking at people in our age group around us, and in a very class agnostic way. I think going back to an earlier conversation about everybody is under some kind of pressure to live up to some kind of an ideal of marriage and family. I find that interesting, because again, like, why I think she was talking about it in the context of why are so many of these women so drawn to DDLJ and Shah Rukh Khan rom-coms, which may often be counter to the kind of existence that they would like to live and the way in which they imagine their own lives. So I think now that we've touched upon all the various ways in which women are kind of getting the short end of the stick when it comes to how love and power have evolved, where does it leave us, I suppose? Like,
I don't want to leave it on a really distressing and sad note, though. And you started out by saying that love isn't necessarily a good thing, and I think that's true. But what is real love? Real romantic love probably is a sort of good and humanizing thing, I think. And that's perhaps why many people seek it out. And I don't just want to talk about women. I want to talk about how many men, young men, boys, adolescent boys, little boys, older men, are also trapped in this really, really sort of difficult, complex, painful cycle where they truly do want to seek out a more gentle, a more affirming way of loving, but they've just never had the role models. And in that context, you can argue that actually cinema and moving images and even TikToks and short form videos have a huge role to contribute in showing nurturing fathers who teach their sons and daughters to be really different from what their fathers taught them, in showing nurturing middle-aged sons who care for their own elderly parents and the elderly parents of their wives in ways which show that men can be caring. And care within romantic relationships, I think, is something which bears a lot more representation. And we see this quite a lot in queer filmmaking in many other countries. So, for example, I've watched some really beautiful African films in which South African films, I've watched films from other countries where you begin to see how societal expectations of men are leading men to either emigrate and leave and try and go away and try and run away and get to the US, or they're sort of giving them heart attacks because there's only so long you can hide your real self for. And usually the people who have to hide their real self are those who don't do well with dominant versions of masculinity. And of course, I understand not all of this is to do with romance. It is to do with gender. These things are completely sort of intertwined. But I will end by saying that I think love is the hopeful thing. And that's perhaps not escapism, but hope that
Yeah.
people go to the cinema for.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love that.
Making me really emotional.
uh,
I
no,
think that's
that's
a great way to end, I
that's
think.
a beautiful note to end it on. Thank you so much, Shaku, for your time. It was lovely to chat with you.
Likewise.
And thank you so much for your insights.
I enjoyed it so much. I think we could have talked for ages. We could have talked about individual films. We could have gone on talking for a long time about this. I mean, there's not enough time in the day to talk about love, romance, life, and film.
No,
But I'm
absolutely.
wishing you both not only joyful romances, but a very good day.
Thank you so much. And likewise. Thanks so much for listening. Thinking People podcast is hosted by Sanaya Chandar and Ketki Sharma. Our producer for this episode is Yash Hirave.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio content. Be sure to follow us at Thinking People Pod on Twitter or X and at Thinking People Pod on Instagram. If you'd like to get in touch, write to us at thinkingpeoplepodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode.